thank you, Professor Conway and Dr. Stringini, for joining us this morning. Sorry we've had to wait a little while, but these are huge subjects where the questioning and the answers are about to go on. Very grateful to you for attending. This is on the record, this exchange, and there's a transcript afterwards if you would need to change it. We're trying to focus in a very broad canvas on the way in which the enormous upheavals in technology and communication are affecting diplomacy, and particularly our diplomacy here. And of course, behind that is a bigger question of whether it's affecting the whole way in which states react to each other, and the whole interstate model, as it were, upon which diplomacy is built, or whether we're finding there are new forces at work which upset this model completely. So, if I may first just ask for a little general summary from both of you on how you see that broad question, whether we're on the right track at all, in fact. Could I start, Professor Conways, or in the middle? First, please. Thank you.
So thanks for the invitation. I'm happy to be here. Yeah, so my research has focused on two things in particular over time. One is so all of it is focused on violent extremists and terrorists and the internet and the intersections between those. And two things in particular, like I said. So number one, I've been interested for, I guess, 2 decades or so now, in how violent extremists and terrorists use the internet on a day-to-day basis. And so, in particular, for influence operations, for propaganda dissemination, if you like, and the potential impacts of that activity. And I've also written fairly extensively, number 2, on so-called cyber terrorism. So the use of the internet for attack purposes, or indeed an attack on critical information infrastructures. For me, I have always felt that the focus, our focus, should largely be on the influence operations aspect. And I haven't had cause to change my position considerably over time. So I'm skeptical about the cyber terrorism threat even up to the present time, though I will say that, of course, there is the possibility with, in particular, the Internet of Things, that things could change relatively rapidly going forward.
Thank you. Dr. Stringini.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me here today. So in my research, I mostly study cybercrime, so typically how organized criminals, so non-state actors, adversaries are essentially using technology and the internet to perpetrate crimes. So in particular, I've been studying for over 10 years the threats linked to malware and how essentially criminals are infecting computers all over the world, and then they are organizing them in botnets. So essentially all the infected computers will report to a controller, which is accessed by the criminal, and they can either be given orders to perform additional criminal activity, or they can report back stolen data, for example, and so on. So in this frame, essentially, what the internet changed is the fact that criminals do not need physical contact with their victims anymore. So they can suddenly affect people from all over the world without moving, essentially. They can reach many more people. So if you think about the, for example, the advanced fee fraud that started, a couple of centuries ago. So these would be people sending out letters promising a very financially rewarding scheme in exchange for a fee. So, you won a very large amount of money, you need to pay this fee to unlock it, to get the money and so on. But back in the day, they had to actually physically find recipients, send physical letters and so on. Nowadays, they can just press a button and suddenly reach, millions of people potentially. So this is an example of how the reach actually increased. The other problem is the fact that they can essentially hide their tracks very effectively. So It is often not clear where they are located. It is often not clear whether these control servers that we are observing are actually directly where the criminals are sitting, or they might be, relayers, proxies. And so the criminals are essentially relaying the connection through several countries to sort of make it more difficult for this activity to be traced. So this is from the organized crime point of view, and more recently we are seeing more state actor type of activity, which in many cases is similar. So the same kind of the same kind of elements appear. So people can attack victims from far away. They can hide their tracks. They can deceive attribution, so they can make it look like actually it is another nation state performing the attack. And oftentimes the two groups are not necessarily disjoint. So we are witnessing, for example, non-state actors who are actually collaborating with national states to perform more like cyber warfare, if you like, types of activity.
I'll follow up, if I may, and just something that Dr. Strangini said, which is to say that in much the same way, violent extremists and terrorists, so the positive aspects of the internet for them that go beyond what was available to them with respect to propaganda production and dissemination previously, is a greatly increased speed, greatly increased spread, so you can spread your content globally, and a greatly increased audience that it's possible to reach, and you can do this relatively cheaply. So speed, spread, audience, cheapness, I think are important. Secondly, I would say on the cyber terrorism issue, it's interesting to think about attribution there, because it's a different realm to cyber warfare, if you like, because with terrorism, generally you want attribution. So terrorist attacks or terrorists have an interest in their attacks being associated with them largely, and not the other way around.
Thank you very much. I know Brokaw, would you like to pursue this?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what Professor Conway did. Were you saying that digital technologies, so far as terrorist groups are concerned, haven't increased the threat to quite the extent that you might have thought that they would have done? Was that what you said, or did I misunderstand you?
That's an interesting question. So a question in this realm for researchers in this realm is the change that the internet has wrought more evolutionary or more revolutionary, if you like, and people have quite different perspectives on this. And for me, what I would say is that, of course, the dissemination of propaganda content and engaging in influence type operations is nothing new from a terrorism perspective, because one of the things that we often say in terrorism studies is that terrorism is a means of violent communication. So the communicative aspect of terrorism is very important. For quite a long time, terrorists had to rely on the violence to speak for itself, if you like, or they had to allow for their violence to be interpreted by third parties. Generally, the media were quite influential in that respect. What the internet does is it takes away a lot of this mediation, if you like. So now it's possible, since, say, the mid-1990s, for terrorist organizations to communicate directly via the internet with their supporters, their fan communities, if you like, but also their victims and policy communities, and just basically global publics. So I guess what I'm saying is that the speed with which they can put out their content is increased. The audience that they can reach is greatly bigger than it once was. And so this is quite a significant change, but the thing in itself remains similar, if you like.
I see. And what about our capacity to deal with it, or what about the state's capacity to deal with it?
So the issue here is that up until relatively recently, states had very significant capacities in this respect because many terrorist campaigns were really quite limited in the past to some region within countries, to some country, or to some small group of countries within a region. Now, the global aspects of some of these terrorism campaigns is much greater, obviously, while at the same time the ability of states to close down this information or propaganda dissemination is much less clearly than it once was. And this precisely goes to, for example, the conduit in the past for this information being, for example, the mass media. And now, as we know, social media companies and other online spaces are very important in this respect also. Though it has to be said the mass media is still playing a significant role. But the ability of governments to regulate these social media, these online platforms thus far is simply not as great as it was for more traditional media forms.
So there has been, you're saying, a real transfer of power. I mean, the information itself is power. Power to recruit, power to promote causes, good and bad. And that obviously alters the challenges facing state governments and traditional methods.
That's absolutely correct.
Yeah. Now, I just would like to Lord Hannah.
Just a follow-up to that. You've addressed, I think, very clearly what I'd call the law enforcement aspects of this, the criminality aspects of it. But could you, as you go through, also address the question of whether these technological developments, this revolution in technology, how it's affecting a government's ability to conduct diplomacy in their dealings with other states and in their dealings with the citizens of other states?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I did some work a number of years ago now where I considered the Lebanese Shia organization known as Hezbollah and their what I called at that time public diplomacy campaign. Because this was at around the time when public diplomacy was emerging as a more central issue for governments globally, but especially in Western contexts. And I considered just Hezbollah, but you can consider any terrorist organization's activity within this sort of frame of reference also. Because what a lot of the groups who came to be active online from the mid-1990s onwards, so the early adopters, if you like, in the terrorism world, what they wished to do with their websites, later forums and what have you, was to reach out to global publics and to tell their story without the mass media acting as interlocutors, because when the mass media act as interlocutors, they of course tend to draw attention to the negative aspects of terrorist organizations' activity, unsurprisingly, obviously. And so what online platforms, originally websites, like I say, and laterally social media accounts and what have you, allow these groups to do is to portray themselves in the light in which they wish to be portrayed. So when I think about diplomacy, I guess I think about this ability that they have developed over the last, say, 20 years or so, which obviously then poses pretty significant problems for the diplomatic efforts of various nation states.
Lord Balfe, would you like to raise your question at this point?
Yes. We talk about governments and terrorists and other similar organisations, but of course one of the key factors is the multilateral organisations, such as the UN, NATO, and the like, and their decision-making structures make it much more complex for them to take effective action. I wonder whether you've got any thoughts on how UK diplomacy could sharpen its act up in pushing for a higher level of identification, realisation and action with our multilateral partners.
Okay, so I'll speak for the crime angle. So actually there have been a number of multilateral operations to crack down specific organized criminal operations. So a couple of examples deal with drug markets. So in particular, these days there are many websites on the dark web, so it's this network that is not accessible through regular means, but you need a specific software essentially to access it. And as a side effect, the location of the network as well as of the different people using it is not known. So there have been a number of police operations to actually take down these services, and the UK had a prominent presence in these operations. So in particular, the NCA was involved in both Operation Anonymous, which was in 2013, and Operation Hyperion, which was in 2015. So there are already these frameworks, and they typically are sort of mediated by Europol or Interpol, and so on.
What about the more diplomatic areas? I mean, telegrams from embassies notoriously were hacked in the late 30s and 40s because they broke the codes. But, you know, there's a lot of confidential diplomatic traffic that goes backwards and forwards. Mm-hmm. To what extent do you think that can be compromised, and what should we do?
That could definitely be compromised in a variety of ways. So typically any content that's transmitted online is encrypted. So if any actor were to intercept the traffic, they wouldn't be able to actually make sense of what the traffic is. So what adversary actually moved on doing is actually compromising the endpoints. So they would compromise computers within the House of Parliament, let's say, and then they would perform some lateral movement, and essentially, which means that they would compromise additional computers, eventually get to the sensitive data. And potentially they would later on use this data themselves or leak it, which is something that has been happening more and more. From the diplomatic angle, a big problem there is actually attribution. So once, let's say, the UK government realizes that they've been breached, it's fairly difficult to tell who is behind it. And the reason is that the difference between cyber weapons, so this code that's actually exploiting vulnerabilities, exploiting computers, and traditional weapons, the difference is that once a cyber attack is launched, the other party can essentially intercept the attack traffic, re-weaponize it, and use it later on against someone else. And actually, as part of one of the leaks that was published last year by WikiLeaks, and this affected the CIA, there is evidence that the CIA was allegedly effectively using code that comes from other countries to essentially attack third parties and make it look like the other country is responsible for it, right? So this creates many challenges for diplomacy, because suddenly somebody might be blamed for an attack that they didn't commit.
Can you give an example?
Well, it's difficult to attribute these attacks, but for example, WannaCry has been attributed to North Korea, and as we just heard from the previous witness, NotPetya has been attributed to Russia, and haven't seen the evidence, so I'm sure that they have strong evidence about that. But in principle, it's possible that these attacks were misattributed. And if retaliation was actually performed on the basis of these claims, and it was actually the wrong kind of attribution, it would be a problem.
This non-attribution aspect you touched on, that's really a very deep problem, isn't it? Because if a society or country's interests are directly and painfully attacked, as we heard in the case of the Ukraine in an earlier session, how does, and one cannot attribute the source to another state. What's the answer? To threaten the state that you think they might be, or to use conventional threats against cyber attacks? I mean, explain to us how the modern diplomat faces this absolutely unprecedented situation.
Yeah, I mean, this is not really my area, so I work on the technical aspects of this mostly. I think that the information that this kind of attribution is based on should be as accurate as possible. And oftentimes the information that we saw, at least leaking to the public, is not bulletproof. So the fact that certain attack code was used that was used by another nation state in the past does not necessarily mean that the same nation state was behind it, because it could just be that, let's say, the UK was attacked by a certain nation state, they collected the attack data, the attack code, and then later on weaponized it again to make it look like a third party performed the attack. If we are looking at where the attack is coming from, so looking at computers that are launching these attacks, these might be infected computers in the first place, they might be proxies, so sort of intermediaries and so on. So it's very difficult to actually be able to tell who's behind it, right? So I think that there needs to be a much more comprehensive collection of evidence before diplomatic action can be taken.
But without too much blue sky thinking, I mean, is there a role for the existing international institutions, or new ones even, to try and get a grip on this problem, which actually faces every country, regardless of its politics, regardless of its diplomacy, regardless of its nature of government? Every country is threatened by the non-attribution problem as to where their security challenges are coming from.
Yeah, so there is a lot of discussion on this. I think nobody came to an agreement yet. So some ideas that have been floated around deal with essentially regulating this kind of exploit code and so on in the same way as weapons are. So, you cannot export them easily and so on and so forth. But this actually creates problems for the security industry at large. So the security industry is relying on either volunteers or people who are doing it as a job. They are finding problems in software. They are reporting it, oftentimes they get paid for it, and then the hole is closed, right? If it became illegal, let's say, for someone in the UK to report vulnerabilities of software of companies that are actually based in the US, suddenly these holes would not be fixed anymore. And then, criminals would be free to attack them and exploit them, right? So there are many, many challenges there, and I feel like we don't have solutions yet.
Professor Conway, would you have a view on that, on what the multilateral role is going to be in this completely changed world?
Yeah, so for myself, I guess my familiarity is less with the activity that was just being described by Gianluca and more about discussions around regulation back to the content again. So if we're talking about violent extremist and terrorist content, over the last number of years, there's been a lot of activity, and the UK has been a central player in that from a diplomatic and a policy perspective. So, for example, the UK was the first country to set up an internet unit, so the counterterrorism internet unit, the CTIRU, within the Metropolitan Police, for example. And what they did and continue to do up to the present time is to alert social media companies and other online platforms when they're hosting terrorist content, and they request them to take down that content. And this is interesting because if we're using a sort of an expansive definition of diplomacy, because of course all they can do is make a request to these companies, and these companies can decide to proceed on the basis of that request or not. Numerous other European Union countries also have set up similar internet referral units in the last number of years, many of them modelled on the UK case. So that's, I guess, one aspect of the thing. If we're talking about at the multilateral level, there are some interesting initiatives over the last number of years, again with respect to disrupting this violent extremist and terrorist content. So, for example, at the UN level, there is an initiative, again, in which the UK played a role called Tech Against Terrorism. And so the Counterterrorism Committee of the United Nations is also a sponsor of this initiative. And what it seeks to do is to alert smaller social media companies and other online platforms to the risks that they might face in terms of their oftentimes perhaps even unwittingly hosting in particular terrorist content. So, of course, Facebook, YouTube and other major social media companies now have a very heightened awareness about the circulation of violent extremist and terrorist content on their platforms, and they are engaged in disrupting that, and they have been for a number of years. But one of the upshots of that disruption is that the content is now moving to other online spaces. And one of the things that terrorist organizations and their supporters have realized is that smaller and newer companies don't have the same kind of resources or the same kinds of capacities as the really big players. And so oftentimes their content, the terrorist content, can be hosted on those platforms for some time before any disruption activity begins, if it begins at all. So the Tech Against Terrorism initiative seeks to educate people in the startup community and who are responsible for these other more low-profile platforms about this issue. And then I guess thirdly, I would say another important part of all of this has been the EUIF, so the European Union's Internet Forum, where again the UK government has played a leading role along with France and Germany and other EU member states. I will say at this point that Voxpol, the EU-funded research project that I'm the coordinator of, is a party to the EU Internet Forum. And so one of the, a lot of the activity I think that has taken place over the last number of years as regards disrupting the circulation of this content on major social media platforms has been as a result of the activity of the EUIF and the pressure that's been brought to bear on the major social media companies with respect to this content.
Thank you. So I suppose the question is, what next? Lord Reid, would you like to?
Yes, it's basically about, and again, as Lauren Haney asked you earlier, if you could, I know it's not your area, but if you could try and look at some of the future developments in technology and how they might affect international relations, diplomacy, state to state or people to people. We're aware that artificial intelligence is coming along. We're aware that the Internet of Things is going to further embed technology in all our homes and all our institutions. We're aware that we are, as the last witness said, on the cusp of quantum and quantum computing. So what sort of effect might these, if you'd like to speculate at this stage, what sort of effect might these have on our international relations, diplomacy, and the relationship between nation states?
Okay, so, well, there are a number of ways in which all these technologies can be used maliciously. And luckily, I would say, so far, adversaries haven't found a good way, for example, to monetize and exploit Internet of Things devices. So Internet of Things devices are all over. You know, they can be wearable devices, there can be home assistants, they can be, you know, smart fridges or whatever, thermostats and so on. They are all connected to the Internet to some extent. And so far, all the attacks that are targeting these devices leverage the fact that these devices have Internet connectivity. So basically, these devices are used as pawns, if you like, into large-scale denial of service attacks. So essentially, the attackers would send traffic, network traffic, to all these devices, and all these devices will attack a third party. So potentially what could happen now is, you know, once again, some sort of misattribution, in the sense that a third party, let's say a nation state, suddenly sees all these malicious connections from another country, but actually this is just traffic bouncing off, and it's not actually generated by there. But all these devices actually have a lot of potential, because they are able to record videos, they're able to record audio, they're able to control physical systems. So think about you know, smart locks, you know, thermostats, as I said, as well as, you know, self-driving vehicles and so on. So in the future, both organized criminals could find ways of monetizing this, which could include blackmail type of activity. So, you know, people would get recorded and then later on would be blackmailed about whatever was recorded, as well as cyber terrorism or cyber warfare type of activity. So suddenly criminals or attackers could cause cars to crash, or you know, things like that. So these are all challenges that that will probably come up. Something else related to artificial intelligence. So there is a big concern about essentially doctored evidence. So technology is able to essentially modify the people in a video in ways that are fairly convincing. So essentially, evidence could be fabricated. That you know, somebody was in a place and said something with fairly strong video evidence, and this could have massive repercussions if you know, this person was, for example, a politician or something like that, saying something compromising, and so on, while this never happened, right? So a question would be, how do we even tell whether a video is authentic or not? So far, these technologies are not perfect, so they're fairly convincing, but if you look at the video, there are some glitches in the, you know, the way that faces move and you know, the mouth moves and all of that. But potentially, you know, these technologies would become better and better. So it would be very, very difficult to actually say if evidence is true or not.
Yeah.
Can I just ask you, is there a country that leads in terms of its technological capability to use this technology, or are we all in the same kind of space?
From the nation state point of view, I'm not aware of any incidents that involved these technologies. So this was, you know, speculation in the future. So from the research point of view, there are a number of countries that lead in, you know, artificial intelligence and you know, Internet of Things technologies and so on. And you know, the UK is one of them.
And when you say future, are we talking 5 years time, 10 years time?
It's difficult to say. Probably 5 years time would be a good estimate.
Now, I'm going to ask you a final question, which is probably rather pointless asking our earlier witness, but it's this. When oil began to dominate the world economy and Standard Oil began to dominate oil, it became the overweening monopoly, and indeed shaped the whole motor industry and created many other consequences as well. The reaction of the political world and the public was to break up the monopoly. Which was done with tremendous ruthlessness in the United States. Now we look at what appear to be a set of vast monopolies dominating the information system of the globe. Is it practical to think in terms of breaking them up?
Yeah, I think that clearly there are a relatively small number of, in particular, social media platforms that, for example, have dominated in terms of where my interests lie. So with the circulation of this violent extremist and terrorist content. And so one of the interesting things I think has been that, you know, many people ask me, okay, so where do you find this content? And sometimes people have in mind that I have to, you know, dig very deeply online, and in particular, people think that this content must only be available, for example, on the dark net or in other sort of shady corners of the internet. But of course, up until quite recently, even very explicitly terrorist content, so the content produced, for example, by the so-called Islamic State, was really very easily available on really major social media platforms, and in particular, what people consider to be, you know, the big platforms. So, in particular, Facebook, obviously, which truly dominates. Also, Google's YouTube, and then thirdly, Twitter. And so, you know, another aspect to this was that for some time, the response of these companies to the circulation of this content on their platforms wasn't what many governments and policymakers thought it ought to be. And in fact, there are governments and policymakers who still don't think that the response is sufficient. Having said that, like I already mentioned, there have been for the last number of years ongoing contacts, relatively frequent contacts between governments, particularly in the European space, so in the European Union space with the Internet Forum, because an important part of the Internet Forum is, of course, that the social media companies are parties to that forum. And what they've done laterally now is established the so-called GIFCT, so the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. And that's been established again by the big five, so 4 major social media companies and Microsoft indeed are responsible for that. And I would say that that has come directly out of those contacts and negotiations between, in particular, EU member states and others, and the social media companies, and a realization on their part that they would have to, you know, respond on this issue, and in a more convincing way that they had been doing to date.
Lord Reid.
Yes, it's on this question of counter-terrorism or counter-criminality or whatever, we tend to look at atomised risk. We look at one technological development. Have you, in the course of your studies, given any consideration to combinations of risk? What I mean bluntly is we're now all used to drones. We now know that facial recognition can pursue you from a drone. Viral warfare is now very much in the news. If you put those three together, it's quite a frightening combination. Have you given any thought to that, or do you know people who have?
So I guess from my perspective, one of the things that I think is underrated, and I think this goes somewhat to your question, but one of the things that's underemphasized perhaps with regard to the so-called Islamic State and their successes is that the conflict in Syria is very much a hybrid conflict. And if we consider the Islamic State as just one of a very large number of players in that conflict, a very important part of all of this, obviously, is what's going on the ground in the conflict in Syria. And their involvement in that. And then there is the terrorism piece, and in a Western European context, that's what concerns many policymakers and what have you. And then there's also this really significant online piece. And over the last number of years, so since the establishment of their so-called caliphate in the summer of 2014, those three things have all come together in such a way to give them, a very high profile as actors in that conflict and in the terrorism space more widely. So I do feel like oftentimes we put very significant emphasis on the online aspect, and my particular research interest is in that. But I do think an important part of it, obviously, and an important part of their successfulness, in inverted commas, has very much got to do with the nature of the conflict that's ongoing on the ground in Syria, in conjunction with this terrorism piece, in conjunction with the online aspect of things also. And so they've had significant, again, in inverted commas, successfulness from their perspective with regard to the development of their online strategy. But at the same time, they've also made significant strides in other technology areas. So, for example, they have developed a variety of IEDs, so improvised explosive devices that they've employed on the ground. And you mentioned drones. They're also relatively heavy drone users, some of which activity we can actually witness in their online content and their online videos that they've circulated.
And now with
for
facial
example,
recognition, a drone can
Correct.
target and follow you?
Correct. So there is certainly the possibility there. I guess what I would say in a more general way is that over time what we have witnessed is very often a trend whereby technologies that are utilised by nation states are very often then utilised subsequently by terrorist organisations. So they learn by the activities of nation states. So the fact that nation states are now using drones and other types of technologies, what the past tells us is that we can expect that other actors will increasingly begin to think through how they can use those also. And that's why, too, I guess I would say that for a very long time I was skeptical in terms of the cyber terrorism piece. I remain somewhat skeptical for reasons having got to do, in fact, with attribution and, the sort of bang for the buck aspect of cyber terrorism. So, for example, things like taking down the power grid and what have you have the possibility to be conceived of as accident and whatnot, and that doesn't make, again, in inverted commas, for successful terrorist attacks. But changes in another thing that you mentioned, so the Internet of Things, probably means that there'll be many, many more avenues of risk that can be exploited by terrorist organizations. And we see already that cyber attacks are being carried out by other actors and below the state level, obviously. So we might expect going forward that this might also prove to be attractive to terrorists. I don't think it's attractive in the very short term, I will say, because what we have seen most recently is that very low-tech, very cheap types of attacks have been successfully crowdsourced, if you like, in particular by the so-called Islamic State. So their supporters have carried out vehicle attacks and other types of attacks that, like I say, are very cheap to carry out, are very low-tech in their nature, but have resulted in really massive exposure and increased levels of fear in a variety of Western and other countries. And given that's possible, cyber terrorism is something potentially much more complex, potentially much more subject to failure from a terrorism perspective, and therefore it probably isn't as attractive as perhaps people think it might be on the face of it.
Well, that's a fascinating summary. Dr. Stringini, would you have a final comment to make on that whole area as well?
Yes, so from the point of view of organized crime, criminals are already using multiple technologies in conjunction with each other. And in particular, what we are witnessing is single criminal actors specializing in a specific step within the criminal operation, let's say, solving CAPTCHAs, which are, these weird-looking sentences that computers shouldn't be able to solve, or being sure that the same malware or the same, matching malware is installed on a mobile phone and on a computer that belongs to the same person, and this can defeat, two-factor authentication and so on. So every time there is a new technology and a new opportunity for monetizing it from a criminal point of view, someone will specialize in that. And so we are already seeing that. A challenge with newer technologies like drones and Internet of Things and so on is for criminals to figure out a way to monetize it as at a large scale, right? And so this is what is slowing down adoption by criminals of these specific technologies. But I think this will happen